us. Always ready to learn. Tune into 1873 FM. Your voice, your power. 1873 FM.
I want to find out what it is that you have done for the people of Angola so far. I mean, you want to be the change that you want to see. So what change? Because we can sit here and talk about all the problems Angola has and all the problems Africa has.
I'm not just here to paint badly our current government, but we also have some ways. And one of them, talking politically, is that we want to give back, what we are calling citizenship back to them. What I mean by that? What I mean is that in Angola, unfortunately, and I think this is a problem of most African countries. It's like, if you are not a holder of a membership of the current party.
Concerning the inviting people to come to Angola, people are complaining concerning the visa. Put your passport in the embassy. Sometimes it takes 1 month or 2 months for you to get the visa. Once you're in the government, are you going to work on that?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Benjamin. What we assist is that one can submit his visa application and he can stay for 2 or 3 months. Once, he's a businessman. He has a lot of activities. We also want to change this bureaucratic way of treating people who are interested to go in Angola,
Naleli Baltina and Tinashe.
Come on! Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 1873FM. Hashtag 1873FM.
Well, it's gone exactly 8 o'clock Central African time. Our time in use on the 1873 FM. And yes, it is the Santon Express morning show with your host, Tinashe Mpasiri, as we continue with the conversations on the power of storytelling. And yes, each and every story is got so much that one individual, each and every individual can actually learn from, draw lessons from, and more importantly, be inspired by that particular story. And one such story that we are going to hear from is the story of Fred Eboka. Fred, a wonderful morning to you, and thank you so much for giving up time to be on the 1873 FM this morning.
Good morning. How you doing?
Well, pretty much excited to have you on the other end of the line finally, so that we can actually be able to have a conversation and you just telling your story, particularly of your journey in this industry that you happen to be in, that is the fashion industry. But maybe before we get you to tell your story, you could kick off by just briefly introducing yourself. Who is Fred Eboka, and more importantly, what is it that Fred does? And then we can get into the story of how you began your journey to be one such individual who happens to be in the fashion industry.
Well, I don't know where to start from. I've been in the industry for a very long time now. My story is that I started from the U.S. I studied fashion actually in Nigeria, and then later went to the U.S. to study fashion and textile, and then furthered into visual communication in the Tyler School of Arts in Temple University in Philadelphia, and set up my studio in Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia. Eventually met my wife, who is South African, and decided to come to South Africa and established my studio in South Africa in 1993. And when I came here, South Africa was very great. It was before the first democratic dispensation. So I kind of find a niche market in trying to brighten the fashion industry and start introducing color blocking and more African-oriented type of clothing, which became my space doing African couture. And got to dress a lot of the parliamentarians and stuff like that. And ever since, I have never really looked back.
So, if you're just to share with us, Fred, you mentioned that it was from Nigeria that you started before you went off to the United States, where you actually studied fashion and textile. How was that journey from, let's say, you growing up? Is it something that you actually dreamed of being an individual who is in this industry? And how was the journey from Nigeria to USA?
Well, when I grew up, I actually studied, in my high school, I did science because my parents wanted me to be in science field like civil engineering or at worst, be an architect. But it was a great disappointment to especially my dad, being the only boy, and to actually decided to go in the field of art, which created a lot of issues when I was young. And it took some time to, but I've always been somebody who is driven by creativity of one area or the other. It's just that for me, fashion became the science of creating clothes for people and making people beautiful. So that became my driving point into clothing.
Okay, and your journey yes, your journey from the United States to South Africa. How was it like? Obviously, your wife played a pivotal role in your being in South Africa. Am I correct to say so?
Not one way or the other, because when we start dating, I got exposed to the South African community then. And, start partying with them, met Huma Sakela, met, Sinamani, who, Somizi was one of them at that time. And, I kind of met quite a number of South Africans in that community. So I became more interested and became part of that community. So eventually, when South Africa started opening up, a cousin of my wife, who is actually a very close friend of mine, came to South Africa. He was in a corporate area. He was in a corporate field. Came to South Africa and find South Africa to be opening up, came back to America and said, "Hey, Fred, we got to go to South Africa and set up something." And I said, "Why must I go to South Africa? That was not my plan." And he said, No. South Africa needs people like you who establish business in America, and we can really do good in South Africa, setting up businesses and stuff like that. So I discussed with my wife, and she was a little bit wary about it because the memory of apartheid was still in her head, and she couldn't study engineering in South Africa during apartheid. So that's why she came to America to study engineering. And we happened to meet in the same school because we attended Philadelphia University, where I studied fashion and textile. So that's how our relationship started. And so by and by, I decided to start investigating fashion in South Africa, and I discovered that South Africa was very involved in international fashion then. There were a lot of information about South Africa, industry as far as manufacturing, some niche market in manufacturing is concerned. So I became more drawn to it, and on the basis of those information, and personally, I wanted to return to Africa anyway. I wanted to return because I felt like whichever knowledge I have acquired in America, eventually it has to be useful in Africa. So even though I set up my business, my eventual ambition is to come back home to Africa. So, that has always been part of the plan. And being married to a South African made it even more possible for me, because I could easily just pack and say, you know what, I'm going to a place where I could call my home as well, So that was the journey. There are a lot of details in between, but, that's a story for another day.
Well, I find it quite interesting that you actually came to South Africa. That was before the first democratic dispensation to actually set up a studio. And I mean, many people always state that you find that many times. Many people, as individuals, we always tend to blame a situation for why we are not where we ought to be, or why we have not actually progressed in some certain areas of our lives. And here you are, you find yourself in South Africa before the first democratic dispensation, 1993. That is still the apartheid era. I mean, how did you manage to actually set up at that time when when in actual fact as individuals we always tend to blame that I'm not where I am because of apartheid and so and so?
Well, I've always been a very ideological person. I've always been informed by the work of Steve Biko. And even while I was in Nigeria then, I didn't know much about Nelson Mandela, but I knew a lot about because on the intellectual ground, in the academics, Steve Biko was more known then. So we followed the writings and all the stories and stuff about Steve Biko. So I've always been driven by the need to contribute to Africa. And actually, being in America further reinforced that need because my ambition to come to Africa and do something was further reinforced by being in America and see how Americans feel about America. And I experienced all the truths and all the lies. And I realized that consequently, the world doesn't owe Africa much. Africa owes itself to develop itself and believe in itself and develop itself. We have to do it intentionally, and we have to believe in ourselves intentionally. And these things are not things that we have a choice about. If we don't do it, we stay behind. If we do it, we move forward. And that is the bridge we have to cross. Africa is at the point where I believe that we could achieve anything we want to achieve. Whatever our story was or still is in Africa in terms of the oppression of the black men all over the world, in every way you can imagine, the worst atrocity has been put on the black man. Similarly on the Asians too, like the Chinese. But somehow they discover themselves and they realize that only themselves can develop themselves through principle and hard work and change of habits. So for me, I belong to that school of thought that, unless we build Africa, we should not expect anybody to build it for us. And building Africa is not going to be a very easy thing. It's going to boil down to what can we do for Africa, not what Africa can do for us. As long as we all start thinking, what can we do for Africa, and that is what is driving our ambition. Eventually, we will be able to think together and develop. Because we have all the resources in Africa, but we are just not thinking straight. We are not thinking right. We don't believe in ourselves. We don't believe we can get things done in Africa. And that lack of self-belief is what is taking us backwards,
Wow, that's very, something that you raised that I find really profound is the fact that you state that we should not ask ourselves what Africa can do for us, but rather as individuals ask ourselves what it is that we can do for Africa. And it reminds me of the words of former president, the late president of the United States, that's John F. Kennedy, who said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So the same, as the 1873 FM, we have coined our own term that ask not what you can do, ask not what the country can do for you, but what you can do for yourself in the name of the country.
Yes. The issue though is this, like in South Africa today, you asked me about how come people make apartheid an excuse. The reason why we make our circumstances an excuse is that when you are in the circumstances, you are made to believe that circumstance determines your life. I am from a very humble beginning, and my philosophy has always been that I am the architect of my future, and I have to be in the position of the driver's seat to drive my future to the direction that I think will be beneficiary, not only to me, because when you have a larger picture while you are doing something, it gives you a more motivating purpose. The problem we have in Africa today is that individual accolade becomes supreme to the general or collective success. But if we start looking at collective success, if we start pinning our individual success into a more collective success, we'll be able to see a more, larger picture that includes a lot of us. And the whole idea that Africa is segmented the way the colonialists want to see it will vanish. And looking at the crumbs from the table, we will stop looking at the crumbs from the table and start looking at how we get on the table ourselves to actually, create the cake and eat the cake together. But the problem we have in Africa today is individual success that does not lead to collective success. I mean, I go to Europe all the time. I go to Asia all the time. Their philosophy is very, very different from African philosophy. They are more collective in thinking. Whatever, if you talk to an American, and America comes first, America first, that is the way they are oriented. They don't have to think about any other thing. What is there for America? What is beneficial for America? So when you say what is beneficial for America, it means you are saying, or what is beneficial for China, what you are saying is that you buy Chinese products, you elevate Chinese services, you elevate your need to interact with China. So in Africa, you find out that once you put some few money in an African's pocket, his interest entirely change. Champagne becomes his choice of drink. We don't produce it in Africa. In South Africa, we have a similar drink, which we might not even prefer. So our clothing, our whatever we do become external. We undermine our own things. Well, my thing is this: if our things are not good enough, why don't we develop it? Isn't that a challenge for us? Isn't that the reason why those who are successful, who are in charge of capital, who are black, like in South Africa today, we say that, okay, there's no employment, we are looking for direct foreign investment and everything. I am one of those people who don't believe in direct foreign investment. I really don't believe in it, because whenever people invest in your country, they have control of your policy and your politics. So you have to invest in your own country. You have to organically develop your country. I've never had the Chinese say, come and invest my country. I've never had the Germans say, come and invest. I've never had the Japanese say, come and invest in my country. They build their own investment so that they're in control of their own destiny. Why are we so lazy or so scared or so afraid to sacrifice in order to build the future of Africa? Why is it that we are always panhandling all over the world? I mean, recently, African leaders went to China. They line up like little kids with pans in their hands to beg for investment in Africa. I mean, that's disgraceful. How can 50 sovereign nations line up in front of one sovereign nation to beg for a handout? It's disgraceful. I don't believe in it. And those are the principles that I live by. I live by the principle on the fact that whatever you do, it has to directly link with the progress of Africa. Period. If it doesn't do that, know that whatever you're doing is not right. You cannot have capital in Africa, you take it to Europe. You are sabotaging Africa. You cannot be making money from mining in Africa, and you don't think about beneficiating Africa in those products. If you can't do it, then you should think about doing it because Africa needs that. So there are so many ways of thinking in Africa that we have to change. We just simply have to change it. Because if the Chinese can do it, then we can do it. Otherwise, what is the point of arguing that we're equal if we can't behave equally?
Well, you raise very fundamental points there. So now, just looking at yourself and particularly the industry that you've been operating in, that is the fashion industry. If you were to look at 25 plus years into democracy for South Africa, for instance, and the manner in which the industry has actually transformed from then to now. Based on your personal experiences, what would you what is it that you would share with somebody who wants to get into that industry and make a name for themselves?
Well, what I would like to exchange is that there are different. Fashion is so misunderstood, by young people in Africa, especially in South Africa. Fashion is a show business. It's part of show business, right?
Yes.
So in South Africa, I have some few young designers that I mentor, and what I always tell them is the difficult part, that the part they don't want to listen to, but some of them will listen to it. It's a show business. You are either in the business of fashion or you are in the show of fashion. I am in the business of fashion.
Yes.
So if you are in the business of fashion, then you produce, you understand your environment, you understand your client, and whatever you do will be focused on that. But most of the time in Africa, and particularly in South Africa, what young designers do is that they focus more on the show of fashion, which means they want to be popular, they don't want to do the hard work before they are known. They want to be known for fashion while they are not doing the business of fashion itself, to reinforce their foundation in fashion. And I know it sounds very clumsy, but it is a harsh and hard lesson that a designer in Africa or South Africa that want to be successful have to learn. What I always do to those young designers is to tell them, look, build your client base first. After building your client base, or in the process of building your client base, you will be projected to a level where people will recognize you based on your worth. The other way around doesn't work, because by the time you make yourself famous and you don't have a client base, you're living in a la-la land. You're really living in the fantasy, because you are out there in the media, but you don't have the basis for it. So my thing is, do the hard work. I mean, it's the same philosophy for any other profession. You do the hard work first. When you do the hard work first, then you will be recognized on the basis of that.
Okay, wow, that's very profound, I must say. And you mentioned that you have a group of individuals, young individuals who have an interest in this industry, that you also who are actually working under your wing, who are actually learning from your experiences. How many of these individuals are under your wing?
Well, in the past years I've been in this country, there have been many of them. Recently, I have about 14 students who came, and I have to give a general lecture. I mean, I give lectures every now and then. About some few months ago, I was in Lagos at Yaba College of Technology to give a lecture on fashion and how to take fashion forward in Africa. And I've also mentored quite a number. There are too many I can't even count, because some of them were done through institutions like CSIR, which was funded by CSIR, and I have some of them that are on individual basis. Right now in my studio, I have two in my studio. One of them, is already producing on her own brand, but she's producing off in my studio. I gave her a space in my studio to work from, and I have another one who just joined. That similarly I'm trying to develop, with the same principles and philosophy. So over the years, I really can't count. There have been so many of them.
And if you were just to look at Africa and you were to imagine it's a midnight and you were asked to name just three shining stars, being points of light that stand out in as far as the fashion industry is concerned, who are using the industry to also bring people together, are there any three names that would actually come to your mind?
in Africa?
Yes.
Like designers, you mean?
People within this industry, any three names within the industry that you would say these individuals, they are actually playing a role in as far as building these communities of more connected individuals where knowledge is being shared, particularly within the industry, to get individuals ahead.
Well, look, there are many of them, because I think there are many of us, and there are many of even the younger ones who are doing incredible work in developing themselves, and in the process developing other people. Look, some of the names that comes to mind are quite few. I cannot mention, say, 3 of them. I'll be prejudicing other people. But there's a lady in Nigeria that I think that has been doing a fabulous work. Sego. She came to South Africa, few times. There is a lady I came across in Senegal. We had a show together with her, with Mary and Fesley, when I went to have a show in Senegal, Omusi, and that's a while ago now. And I think that she's very impactful, in what she's doing between Paris and Senegal and in Africa. And in South Africa here, there are few of them equally who are doing very impacting work. It's very difficult for me to mention them in South Africa because I don't want to prejudice other ones who think I should have mentioned their name. But there are quite a number of us in the industry. And the thing, though, is that we have to make our work more elaborate. But we operate in the context of what is happening in the country itself. We are just artists, we are designers, but we are also confronted with policies in the fashion and textile industry. We are also confronted with the economy of South Africa and how the whole creating employment and all that is concerned. Import and export, and the kind of protection they give to the people in the industry and the industry itself. So, that is some of the inhibiting forces with the designers in South Africa.
So, in closing, I mean, when you look at individuals who have, like yourself, who happen to be in the industry, particularly the aspect of storytelling in itself, do you think that these stories are being told? And if not so, what would you say is the power of telling of these stories of individuals like yourself who are in the industry and who are making a mark using the fashion industry in as far as transforming other individuals on the African continent?
Well, look, as far as the story is concerned, the media want to hear, and that is what frustrates me sometimes in the industry, is that the media want to hear story like, oh, yeah, fine, everything is good, champagne, this and that, and everybody goes to sleep. We are not really dealing with the core industry and what the industry deserves to really effectively, intellectually, focus. Bear in mind, clothing and textile industry is the entry level to industrialization with any country in the world. I remember once I was having a conversation with the former ambassador of Japan to South Africa, because at that point the wife was my client, and I had a dinner in their home, and he was saying that it seems as though South Africa doesn't understand the importance of textile and fashion, and because the unemployment situation could be solved with that, and how that was very impactful in the development of Japan. And many people don't realize that Japan used to be champion in clothing manufacturing, and textile, So, so for me, the story people need to hear, they don't often hear it. They hear a very, very short version, and it's always about fashion show and the things that follows fashion show. People really don't hear enough story about what the industry requires, the core, information about the industry and how we can influence the industry in a positive direction and develop the industry for the purpose of creating a bigger economy. People don't hear enough of the story, so I can find us. I can actually say, okay, you guys are guilty of that. So you have to do a better job in looking for people like us. And fashion is such a field that it allows everybody, a Jake and Harry, to jump in. So because Jake and Harry jumps in, so the louder noise gets listened to, even though it's got no content.
So, I mean, since you mentioned that, I am also guilty of not being able to play my part in ensuring or that stories are told. How best then do we work together to ensure that these stories are told and they're authentic? I mean, they're authentic stories, and more importantly, that at the end of the day, they are open, frank, and honest conversations around that.
I can say, look, I'll have to congratulate you for interviewing me. So it's the beginning of things. Maybe look for core people in the industry who are very impactful, and probably try to know more about them and their intellectual standing, to know if they are in a position to give you the kind of fruitful information, implementable information that you need, So, but I will really say thank you for interviewing me, because it must have taken a great deal of effort to find me, because I actually, in the recent times, I focus more on the business of fashion rather than being in the media.
So on that note, I really want to thank you, Fred, for your time. But before I let you go off, maybe your last words to our listeners, to our viewers out there. Unfortunately, they cannot get to see your face.
You say what? Maybe what?
Your last words to our listeners.
My last word?
Yes.
Oh, my last word is this. If we believe in Africa, if we believe that we need to be equal to citizens of the world, it is not by agitating for that equality. We have to show it by what we do. We have to change our habit from looking into foreign goods and stuff like that into consuming our own goods. And I will give you an example. When I was constructing my my studio in Santon, I went to buy, somebody who needed a wheelbarrow. And I got to realize that there was a South African wheelbarrow, which cost a little bit more. And the Chinese wheelbarrow cost nothing. But I put my money on the South African made wheelbarrow because I believed in it. And I believe that putting my money in the South African wheelbarrow puts my money in this society. And let me tell you, the South African wheelbarrow, even though it's more expensive, it will last you 10 times longer than the Chinese wheelbarrow, which you will buy about 20 before you can meet the lifespan of the South African made wheelbarrow. So the decision to invest in ourselves cannot be over or underemphasized.
Yes.
So my last word is that South Africa or Africans should, in principle, create the continent they want to live in. Thank you.
Well, on that note, I really want to thank you so much for your time and just for telling your story and sharing your story, your personal experiences, your journey in life, particularly when you look at the business of fashion. On that note, wish you a lovely weekend ahead, and definitely looking forward to engaging and deepening and broadening this conversations.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
You have yourself a lovely day further.
You do the same. Thank you much.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
goodbye for now. All right, that takes my time and yours to 8:33 Central African Time on the 1873 FM Santon Express morning show. And on that note, let's quickly go on a short break. Keep it locked on your channel of choice, the 1873 FM, your voice, your power.
1873.
I know leadership exists, but now my co-host